she hadn't smiled in months. Not since the accident that left her body still and her spirit sinking deeper each day. But in that quiet afternoon, under the soft warmth of the sun, something extraordinary happened. A sound broke through the silence, a laugh. Fragile at first, then growing fuller, like music that had been locked away. It came from a young girl who doctors said might never find joy again. And the reason for that laughter? A boy, no older than 15, dancing barefoot in a billionaire's private garden. His clothes were torn, his feet stained with the dust of the streets, yet his movements carried a kind of freedom that no riches could buy. For the first time, the walls of wealth and despair seemed to vanish, leaving behind a single human moment that no one present could forget. But who was this boy, and why was he there? Her father, one of the most powerful men in the country, stood frozen in disbelief. This was a man who could purchase anything, land, companies, entire cities if he wished, but he could not buy his daughter's laughter. He had spent millions on specialists, therapists, machines that promised miracles but delivered none. And yet here was a boy, with nothing but the rhythm of his own soul, doing what all the money in the world had failed to achieve. Was it fate that led him here, or was it something more? One question lingered heavily in the billionaire's mind. Could this chance encounter change not only his daughter's life, but his entire empire? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Lawson was a man the world admired and feared in equal measure. At 55, he controlled an empire that stretched across industries, real estate, finance, technology. His name alone could sway markets. His presence could silence a room. Yet, behind the glossy magazine covers and endless wealth, there was a silence that money could not erase. At home, the halls of his mansion echoed not with joy, but with absence. He had mastered the art of negotiation, of building, of conquering. But within his own family he was powerless. To the outside world, Richard was untouchable. But inside those walls, he was just a father carrying a wound that refused to heal. That wound had a name, Amanda. His 8-year-old daughter, once a whirlwind of energy, now lay confined to a chair. Months earlier, a tragic accident had robbed her of movement, her body frozen while her spirit dimmed. The girl who once chased butterflies in the garden, who loved spinning in her mother's dresses, now spent her days staring quietly at the world through glass windows. Therapists came and went. Machines hummed, specialists delivered hopeful promises, but Amanda never laughed, never danced, never played. Each day her silence cut deeper into Richard's heart, a reminder that even his vast fortune had limits. And then there was Elizabeth, Richard's wife, Amanda's mother, their anchor. She had been the light that balanced his power with gentleness, the voice that softened his hard edges. But fate had struck cruelly. Elizabeth's sudden passing left Richard and Amanda adrift, two souls bound by grief yet unable to heal each other. For Richard, the loss was more than emotional. It was the collapse of his foundation. Without her, the mansion felt like a museum, each room filled with memories but emptied of life. He could command entire cities, yet he could not summon back the one person who knew how to make both him and his daughter whole. So he turned to what he knew best, money. He brought in experts from around the globe, spending fortunes on the hope of restoring Amanda's joy. Each failed attempt tightened the grip of despair. Laughter, once a simple sound in his home, became a luxury even his billions could not purchase. And just when the last flicker of hope seemed to dim, something unexpected stirred the air. Because one stranger, someone who had nothing but scars and dreams, was about to succeed where world-class doctors had failed. The Lawson mansion was beautiful, but beauty can be a cruel disguise. Inside, its marble floors and towering ceilings carried the weight of silence. Amanda's room overlooked the vast garden where she once played, But now her days were spent watching life from a distance. The toys sat untouched, her dresses untouched, her laughter buried. Every visitor, every doctor, every friend of the family tried to spark a smile, but Amanda's eyes would drift past them, as if the world had become too heavy to hold. To Richard, each day felt like losing her a little more. He wondered often if he had already lost her completely, if her spirit had gone with her mother. But outside the gates of that mansion lived a boy whose story could not have been more different. His name was Kola. Barefoot, ragged and thin from hunger, Kola belonged nowhere and to no one. Nights were spent beneath bridges, days in search of scraps. Yet for all he lacked, there was one thing he carried in abundance: spirit. He had no home, but he had rhythm; no family, but he had resilience. He found freedom not in possessions, but in movement. Dancing was his language, his way of resisting the world that had tried to forget him. The streets were cruel, but when Kola moved, even cruelty seemed to pause. One late afternoon, fate opened a door neither he nor Richard could have imagined. Drawn by the sound of music from inside the estate, faint notes carried by the breeze, Kola wandered toward the Lawson garden. The guards had grown careless, never expecting anyone to trespass on a billionaire's property. And so, barefoot and unnoticed, the boy slipped through the gate and into a world he could never afford to belong to. He didn't come with a plan. Hunger gnawed at his belly, yes, but it wasn't food that made him stop in that garden. It was something else, a presence. A little girl in a wheelchair, staring out at the horizon with eyes that seemed far older than her years. At first Kola froze, unsure whether to run. But then, almost instinctively, he began to move. His feet scraped the earth, his arms flailed awkwardly, his body clumsy yet full of life. He spun and stumbled, waved and twirled. It wasn't polished, it was silly, messy, wild. Yet in that silliness, there was magic, and something extraordinary happened. Amanda's lips curved. A sound escaped her, a small giggle, soft and uncertain, like a melody long forgotten. Then it grew. The giggle became laughter, her laughter became radiant, filling the air and breaking months of silence. For the first time since the accident, she was not a patient or a victim. She was a child again. Richard watched from the terrace, his chest tightening with disbelief. He had spent fortunes on experts, yet this boy, barefoot, nameless and uninvited, had accomplished in minutes what money could not. His daughter was laughing, alive, present. Tears stung his eyes, and he did not care who saw. What had just happened before him defied everything he thought he knew about power, about control, about life itself. But questions lingered. Who really was this boy? Why had fate brought him here, to this place, to this family, at this moment? And what hidden truth was waiting to be uncovered in the days ahead? Kola had no past he was proud of, yet every scar told a story. His earliest memories were of loss, of voices fading, of doors closing. Orphaned at a young age, he drifted from shelter to shelter, until even those walls shut him out. The streets became his teacher, bridges were his roof, abandoned buildings his refuge, and hunger his daily companion. Many would have surrendered to despair, but Kola carried something rare. He carried light. He danced in alleys, in empty lots, anywhere his spirit could stretch beyond hardship. People tossed him coins at times, others tossed him insults. But Kola never let bitterness steal his rhythm. When life gave him nothing, he gave the world his joy. His movements were a rebellion against sorrow, proof that even the forgotten could create beauty. For Richard, this was both a blessing and a burden. He had witnessed his daughter's laughter return, thanks to Kola's uninvited gift. And yet, behind closed doors, a war raged in his heart. Gratitude whispered that the boy had restored what money could not. But pride and fear shouted louder. Richard Lawson was a billionaire, a man defined by control, reputation, and image. What would people say if they knew? that the savior of his daughter's happiness wasn't a world-renowned doctor, but a homeless boy who owned nothing but the dust on his feet. Whispers of judgment haunted him. How would his board, his investors, his rivals, his friends view such a thing? For a man who had built his empire on strength, letting in weakness, even the perception of it, was dangerous. Richard found himself caught between two worlds, the cold, polished empire he had built with steel and stone, and the fragile, unexplainable joy his daughter had rediscovered through a barefoot boy. He walked the mansion halls at night, torn between protecting his public image and nurturing the fragile spark that Amanda so desperately needed. He had always made decisions with precision, calculated risks that turned to fortune. But this was different. There were no charts, no contracts, no guarantees. Just a choice between pride and love. A choice that frightened him more than any business deal ever could. And so, Richard stood at a crossroads. He could keep Cola at arm's length, protect the image of power he had carefully built, and risk losing the laughter that had returned to his home. Or he could open his doors wider, embrace the boy society had cast aside, and accept whatever storms might follow. That night, as his daughter slept peacefully for the first time in months, Richard Lawson made a decision that would change everything. Richard Lawson was not a man who trusted easily. Every deal, every alliance, every decision in his empire was carefully measured, every risk calculated to the last cent. And so, when he allowed Cola to return to the mansion, it was not without caution. He told himself it was only for Amanda, only because her laughter had become too precious to lose. Still, he watched closely from the shadows, studying every movement, every word, every interaction the boy had with his daughter. Part of him hoped to find fault, some reason to shut the door before the world ever discovered what was happening inside his home. Yet each day that passed left him with fewer excuses. Amanda began to change, slowly, gently, like a flower leaning toward the light after a long winter. She ate without protest, her appetite stirring as Cola's presence brought energy into the room. At night, the restless tossing gave way to quiet sleep, the kind that left her cheeks flushed with warmth instead of pale with fatigue. And in the daylight, her smiles grew wider, more confident, no longer fleeting moments, but steady bursts of joy. Richard watched these transformations with disbelief, knowing that no doctor, no machine, no amount of money had ever accomplished what a barefoot boy was now doing with nothing but laughter and dance. But it was one moment in particular that unsettled Richard more than any other. One afternoon, Cola began to spin in the garden, arms wide, steps light, laughter spilling from him as if the earth itself played music only he could hear. Amanda clapped along, her face glowing, and Richard's chest tightened. He had seen these movements before, not in Cola, but in Elizabeth. His late wife had danced in the very same garden, twirling with Amanda when she was still small enough to fit in her arms. The rhythm, the gestures, even the playful stumble that turned into a flourish, it was all there, alive again in the boy who had no way of knowing her. Richard's breath caught as a chilling thought formed in his mind. Was it coincidence? Or had fate carried something of Elizabeth into this boy's soul? The questions kept him awake at night. Logic told him it was impossible, nothing more than a trick of memory and grief, but his heart whispered otherwise, tugging at him with a possibility too strange to dismiss. Could this child, who had lost everything, carry a piece of what Richard himself had lost? Could this be the reason he had been drawn to their garden on that particular day? Richard's pride fought against the wonder he felt, reminding him of appearances, of the empire watching his every move. But each time Amanda laughed, each time her eyes sparkled with life, his pride grew weaker, and love pushed harder to the front. If you're still with us, type, "I'm still here" in the comments. Let's see who's watching this far. The world outside the Lawson mansion had begun to whisper. Neighbors who once envied Richard's estate now leaned in close to exchange quiet rumors. "Have you heard? A homeless boy is living in the billionaire's home." Some dismissed it as gossip, but others clung to it as truth. In circles of wealth, image was everything, and Richard's polished reputation was suddenly at risk of being stained by a boy who owned nothing. For the first time, what had been a private matter between father, daughter, and stranger began to spill into the court of public opinion. The empire Richard had built on strength now trembled under the weight of suspicion and scorn. It didn't take long for business to follow. Richard's partners, men who had once admired his discipline and decisiveness, came to him with warnings thinly disguised as advice. They told him he was jeopardizing everything: the company's stock, their global ventures, the legacy he had promised to leave behind. "What will the investors say when they hear?" one demanded. "You've let your grief blind you," another pressed. They did not see Amanda's laughter or her healing spirit. They saw only headlines, scandals, and risk. To them, Cola was not a miracle. He was a liability, and the more they pressed, the more Richard felt the noose of expectation tighten around his neck. Then one night, the fragile balance shattered. Cola was gone. No note, no trace, only silence where joy had once been. Amanda waited by the window, eyes searching the garden until they filled with tears. When the truth set in, her cries pierced the house, echoing through the marble halls like a wound reopening. Richard rushed to her side, but nothing he said could soothe her. The boy who had given her laughter, who had brought light back into her eyes, had vanished without warning. Richard had never seen his daughter weep so uncontrollably, not even after the accident. In that moment he realized just how deeply she had come alive because of Cola, and how much she stood to lose again. For Richard, the choice could no longer be postponed. He could protect his pride, shield his empire, and let the boy's disappearance become another forgotten story. Or he could risk everything: his reputation, his fortune, his carefully crafted image, to fight for the one person who had succeeded where doctors and money had failed. The decision gnawed at him, heavier than any deal he had ever signed. He knew one truth with certainty: if he let Amanda lose Cola, he would lose her too. But Richard did not yet know the whole story, because the truth about Cola's past was darker than he could have imagined, and once it surfaced, nothing in his world would ever be the same again. Richard Lawson's search for Cola began quietly, through private investigators who owed him favors, through questions whispered in corners far from the boardroom. What started as a desperate attempt to find the boy for Amanda's sake soon became something more: a journey into a past that Richard had never expected to confront. Slowly, fragments of Cola's life came together: an orphaned child, a family once bound by love, and a tragedy that stripped it all away. His mother had died young, his father disappeared, and Cola was left to the streets. But hidden within those fragments was a thread that pulled Richard closer than he ever imagined possible. The breakthrough came in the form of an old photograph, worn at the edges, passed through the hands of someone who remembered a face. Cola's late mother, before hardship, before illness, had once worked in the Lawson household. She had been a helper, a quiet presence who assisted Elizabeth, Richard's late wife, during the early years of Amanda's childhood. Richard stared at the picture in disbelief, memories rushing back of familiar smiles, of kind words spoken in passing, of someone who had lived in the margins of his own story, yet had touched the heart of his family. The realization struck him with force. This boy was not a stranger. His path was intertwined with theirs long before he ever danced in that garden. For Richard, it felt less like coincidence and more like destiny. The boy who had restored Amanda's laughter was connected to Elizabeth, to his wife's compassion and the life she once built. It was as if the threads of loss and love had been stitched together across time, leading Cola back to them when they needed him most. Yet with revelation came responsibility, and the weight of it pressed heavily on Richard's conscience. To bring Cola closer meant to defy the voices of wealth and power that already questioned his judgment. To welcome him as more than a guest meant daring to stand against society's gaze, daring to blur the lines between fortune and poverty, pride and humility. The choice was no longer about business or appearances. It was about love, family, and the meaning of belonging. Richard stood at the edge of that choice, torn between the life he had built and the one fate seemed to be offering. The question burned within him. Should Kola remain on the outside, a boy who healed them for a moment but was never meant to stay? Or should he be embraced fully as part of their family, no matter what the world might say? Just when hope seemed steady, life reminded Richard how fragile it truly was. One cold night, Amanda's health took a sudden turn. Her breathing weakened, her body pale and restless, and the doctors rushed her to the hospital. Machines beeped, nurses hurried, but nothing they did could calm her. She cried out in fear, calling for the one presence that had brought her peace before. Richard sat helpless at her bedside, clutching her hand, realizing that all his power meant nothing here. He had never felt so small, so desperate, as his daughter's life seemed to slip through his grasp. And then, as if drawn by fate, Kola appeared once more. He had slipped past the hospital staff, unnoticed, barefoot as always. Without hesitation, he began to move beside Amanda's bed, softly, gently, with the same clumsy yet magical rhythm that had once filled the Lawson garden. At first her eyes barely opened, then a faint smile flickered across her lips. And slowly her laughter returned, fragile but undeniable. The monitors steadied, her breathing calmed, and in that room of fear, joy broke through again. Kola's dance had done what medicine could not. It had given Amanda the will to fight. Richard's composure shattered. For the first time in years, he allowed the weight of his grief and pride to fall. Tears streamed as he whispered the truth he could no longer deny. This boy had saved his daughter in ways no fortune ever could. It was not science, not wealth, not influence. It was love, pure and unguarded, delivered through the steps of a child who had nothing yet gave everything. At that moment, Richard understood. Amanda's laughter was not a miracle of chance. It was the gift of someone meant to be family. And so came the final decision, one that silenced every doubt and every fear. Richard Lawson, the billionaire who once thought he could control the world, made the most human choice of his life. He adopted Kola, not as charity, not as repayment, but as a son. In front of Amanda's hospital bed, he vowed that the boy who had restored her joy would never again face the streets alone. For the first time since Elizabeth's passing, Richard's family felt whole again, not because of wealth, but because of love. Time moved gently in the Lawson household after that night. Amanda's laughter became a daily melody once again, soft at first, then stronger, until the house that once echoed with silence was filled with warmth. She still carried her struggles, but with Kola at her side, she faced them not with despair, but with courage. Her joy was no longer hidden away. It blossomed, reminding Richard every day of the moment he nearly lost her and the boy who gave her back. For Kola, the streets became a memory rather than a future. He no longer slept beneath bridges or begged for scraps. He belonged to a family. He belonged to love. Richard Lawson, a man who once measured life in profits and power, discovered a truth that money had always hidden from him. Wealth could buy comfort, but not laughter. It could build empires, but not heal broken hearts. What restored his family was not influence, not possessions, but kindness. Kola had arrived barefoot and forgotten, yet gave them more than the richest man in the world could buy. Richard often wondered if Elizabeth had guided this boy to them, as if fate had sewn their lives together long before that day in the garden. Whatever the reason, he knew his life would never again be defined by fortune alone. And so, a new chapter began. Not the story of a billionaire and his empire, but of a father, a daughter, and a boy who taught them what it meant to truly live. Sometimes angels don't come with wings. They come barefoot, with laughter, and the courage to dance. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button. It helps us reach more people. And subscribe if you want more gripping stories every day. What do you think? Was this boy fate's gift to Richard and Amanda?